They recorded my time of death at 3:12 a.m., and that number has never left me. I remember the ceiling lights first glaring white and painfully sharp, cutting through my vision like broken glass. The air smelled of antiseptic and something metallic, a bitter taste coating my tongue. Voices echoed above me, urgent and overlapping, but they sounded distant, as if I were sinking underwater while the world stayed behind. I had been in labor for 14 hours at a private hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina. 14 hours of pain that bent my body into something I barely recognized. The nurses kept saying I was strong, that my body knew what to do, that everything was progressing normally. I tried to hold on to that, to the idea that soon I would hear my baby cry and all of this would make sense. Then the room changed. A monitor screamed. Someone said my blood pressure was crashing. Another voice shouted for more units. The word hemorrhage sliced through the air, cold and final. I felt a sudden terrifying warmth beneath me, too much warmth spreading fast, followed by a strange floating sensation, as if my body were slipping away from the bed while my mind stayed trapped inside it. I turned my head, desperate to find Daniel. My husband stood near the wall, his phone still in his hand, his expression tight and controlled, not panicked, not afraid, just focused. I wanted him to come closer, to hold my hand, to tell me I would be okay. Instead, as doctors rushed in and alarms multiplied, the last clear sentence I heard him say was not my name. "Is the baby alive?" The monitor flatlined. The sound shifted into one long, endless tone that seemed to vibrate through my bones. A doctor climbed onto the bed and began compressions. I felt pressure deep and crushing, then sensation drained away entirely. My vision narrowed into darkness, and for a moment I thought this must be what dying feels like. At 3:12 a.m., someone said the words, "time of death." I drifted somewhere cold and weightless, suspended in nothing. But I did not disappear. Minutes later, my heart began beating again. They would later call it Rosk return of spontaneous circulation. At the time, all I knew was a sharp burn in my chest and the invasive slide of a tube down my throat. My body remained still heavy, unresponsive, while machines breathed for me. They sedated me and transferred me to the ICU, assuming my mind had followed my body into silence. They were wrong. Awareness returned slowly, without sight, without movement, just a horrifying clarity. I could hear. I could smell. I could feel fear with nowhere to put it. My body lay frozen beneath wires and tubes, but my mind was awake, trapped inside flesh that would not obey me. That was when I noticed the other sounds, the soft click of heels on tile, the familiar scent of a floral perfume I had once bought as a gift drifting into the room. Somewhere, just outside my door, glasses touched with a quiet chime. Champagne. I realized nausea twisting through me. A woman laughed low and pleased. "At least this part is over," she said. I recognized her voice immediately. Lauren, my husband's assistant, the woman I had told myself not to worry about. My heart rate spiked, triggering a warning beep, but no one reacted. They were too busy talking, too certain of my silence. I heard Daniel again, calm now, relieved. I heard my mother-in-law Elaine discussing next steps paperwork arrangements. They spoke as if I were already gone, as if my body were nothing more than an inconvenience being managed. They thought I was gone. I lay there, unable to scream or open my eyes, listening as my life was quietly divided without me. And just when I believed there could be nothing worse than this, another voice entered the room, steady and professional. The doctor cleared his throat. That was when he said the words that would change everything, words no one in that room was prepared to hear. "It's twins," he whispered. Before everything collapsed into monitors and tubes and whispered decisions made without me, my marriage looked stable from the outside. That was the word people always used. Stable. Daniel and I had been married for 6 years, living in a quiet neighborhood outside Charlotte where lawns were trimmed and neighbors waved without asking questions. We had dinner parties that ended on time holiday cards that looked coordinated and conversations that stayed carefully on the surface. Daniel worked as a financial advisor, a job that rewarded appearances, confidence, and control. He liked things orderly, predictable, impressive to the right people. I learned early on that emotions made him uncomfortable, especially the messy kind. When I cried, he offered solutions instead of comfort. When I needed reassurance, he reminded me of schedules and plans. It wasn't cruelty exactly, more a steady absence of warmth that I kept telling myself was normal. His mother, Elaine, was always present in our lives, even when she wasn't physically there. She had opinions about everything from where we lived to how we set the table. She believed family was a brand, something to be maintained and protected at all costs. Elaine spoke often about legacy, about how the Whitmore name carried weight in certain circles, about how perception mattered just as much as truth. Daniel listened to her the way some people listen to weather reports, attentive and unquestioning. I tried to tell myself that her constant involvement was just concern, that it came from love. Still, there were moments when I felt like a guest in my own marriage, a role that could be adjusted or replaced if it no longer fit. When I became pregnant, everyone said it was the best thing that could have happened to us. Elaine took control, immediately recommending doctors' prenatal classes, even suggesting names before I had fully wrapped my head around the idea of motherhood. Daniel seemed pleased in a distant way, already talking about college funds and future plans. The pregnancy was treated like a project, something to manage efficiently. Every appointment reinforced the same belief: one healthy baby, one straightforward future. That assumption became part of the story they told themselves, and I didn't know how dangerous that certainty would become. Lauren entered our lives quietly, introduced as Daniel's new assistant. Young, capable, always impeccably dressed. At first, she was just a name he mentioned in passing, then a face at office events, then a presence that lingered too long in conversations. She knew details about his schedule that I didn't. She laughed at his jokes before he finished telling them. When I walked into a room where she stood, the air shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain. I told myself I was being hormonal, oversensitive, unfair. Still, there were small moments that didn't sit right. Late nights he blamed on clients. Messages he took into another room. The way Elaine spoke about Lauren with approval, praising her ambition, her reliability, her understanding of Daniel's world. Once halfway through my pregnancy, I asked Daniel directly if there was anything I should be worried about. He looked genuinely surprised, almost offended, and reminded me how much stress could harm the baby. I apologized for doubting him. That apology would echo in my mind later, bitter and misplaced. As my due date approached, the emotional distance between us widened, subtle but undeniable. He attended appointments but checked his phone constantly. He spoke about becoming a father as if it were an achievement unlocked rather than a life-changing responsibility. Elaine discussed post-birth plans with a level of authority that left little room for my input, already mapping out visits, photos, announcements. I felt myself shrinking, my voice growing quieter in rooms where decisions were made. Even so, I believed stubbornly that childbirth would change something, that the moment Daniel held our baby, the wall between us would crack. I held on to that hope through swollen ankles and sleepless nights, through the constant ache in my back and the quiet fear that comes with carrying a life you cannot see. I had no idea that while I was imagining first cries and hospital bracelets, they were already imagining something else entirely. I did not know that to them my role was becoming optional, a variable in an equation they were preparing to solve without me. I didn't know then that they had already decided who my child belonged to. Labor began in the early hours of the morning, quietly, at first, a tightening low in my abdomen that I tried to ignore until it became impossible to mistake for anything else. By the time Daniel drove me to the hospital, the sky over Charlotte was still dark, the city half asleep, and I remember thinking there was something fitting about bringing a child into the world while everything else was paused. The private maternity wing looked calm and reassuring, all soft lighting and muted colors designed to make pain feel manageable. Nurses checked me in with practiced smiles, monitors were attached, and the hours began to stretch. Contractions came in waves that stole my breath and left me gripping the rails of the bed, counting seconds, trying to stay grounded. Daniel sat beside me at first, offering encouragement that sounded rehearsed, like lines memorized for a role he wasn't fully invested in. As the hours passed, the pain intensified, each contraction sharper than the last, my body bending inward, instincts taking over. 4 hours turned into 8, then 12. Sweat soaked through the sheets. My hands shook uncontrollably. The nurses kept assuring me that long labors were common, especially with first pregnancies, that my vitals were stable, that everything looked fine. I wanted to believe them. Somewhere around the 14th hour, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a sudden dizziness that made the room tilt, followed by a deep, spreading warmth that did not feel right. I tried to speak to tell someone that something was wrong, but my words came out thin and slurred. A nurse frowned at the monitor and checked my blood pressure again. Her expression changed. Another nurse was called in. The calm atmosphere fractured instantly. The word hemorrhage was spoken clipped and urgent, and the room filled with people moving fast, their voices overlapping in a way that made it impossible to focus on any one instruction. My heart began to race, then stutter. I felt myself slipping, my thoughts scattering, panic rising in my chest. Someone pressed hard on my abdomen. Another voice called for additional units. I tasted metal and felt cold despite the heat of my body. The monitor alarms grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to echo inside my skull. I searched the room for Daniel, needing something familiar to anchor me, and found him standing back, his face pale but controlled eyes flicking between his phone and the chaos unfolding in front of him. I reached out instinctively, my fingers trembling, but he didn't notice. When the alarms peaked and a doctor shouted for a code to be called, the world narrowed to sound and sensation, then to nothing at all. The flatline tone cut through the room, long and unforgiving. Hands pressed into my chest rhythmically, violently, forcing air and blood through a body that no longer seemed to belong to me. I felt pressure without pain, then not even that. Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, closing like a curtain. For a moment, there was peace in the emptiness, a strange stillness that felt almost like relief. Then everything snapped back with a jolt. My chest burned as if lit from the inside. Air was forced into my lungs, unnatural and harsh. I could not move or speak, but I was aware, again dimly confused, as if surfacing from deep water. Someone said they had a pulse. Another voice confirmed Roassi. The urgency shifted, but it did not disappear. I was intubated, sedated, stabilized enough to be moved. The delivery room faded away as they wheeled me down a hallway, ceiling lights blurring into streaks above me. I was aware of the motion of the hum of the bed beneath me, of the weight of my own body lying useless and heavy. They transferred me to the ICU, surrounded by machines that hissed and beeped, machines that took over the work my body could no longer do on its own. I drifted in and out, not fully unconscious, not fully present, suspended in a state where time lost meaning. My heart was beating again. My blood pressure stabilized, my body technically alive, but nothing else felt intact. I could not open my eyes. I could not lift a finger. I could not tell anyone that I was still there. Voices came and went, discussing labs, medications, outcomes, all of it spoken as if I were an object rather than a person. I heard someone mention neurological status, prognosis, next steps. The words floated above me, detached from consequence. In that sterile room surrounded by evidence of survival, I understood with terrifying clarity that my heart had come back, but my life as I knew it had not. My heart came back, but my life didn't. I did not wake up the way people imagine waking up from a coma. There was no sudden gasp, no dramatic opening of my eyes, no moment where the world snapped back into focus. What returned first was awareness, thin and sharp, like a blade sliding under my skin. I became conscious without control, present without permission. I could not move my arms or legs. I could not open my eyes. I could not even tell if my mouth was open or closed around the tube, forced down my throat. My body was heavy, unresponsive, sealed shut from the inside, but my mind was awake, fully awake, and trapped. Sounds came to me in fragments at first, the steady hiss of a ventilator, the irregular beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of shoes on linoleum. I tried to scream, but nothing happened. I tried to will my fingers to twitch my eyelids, to lift anything to signal that I was still there, but my body did not answer. Panic surged through me in waves, hot and suffocating, but even panic had nowhere to go. I was aware enough to be terrified and powerless enough to endure it silently. Voices entered the room, faded out, then returned again. Nurses spoke in low, professional tones, discussing medication adjustments, oxygen saturation, blood counts. They touched my arms, my neck, my forehead, performing checks with practiced detachment. To them, I was a patient, sedated, non-responsive, and occupied bed in the ICU. They did not know that I was listening to every word. The first time Daniel came in after I was transferred, I recognized him instantly, not by sight, but by the cadence of his voice. He stood close to the bed, close enough that I could feel the vibration of his presence, and spoke quietly, as if whispering would make his words kinder. He said my name once almost out of obligation, then stopped. Elaine joined him moments later, her heels clicking decisively across the floor, her voice steady and composed. She asked the nurse about my condition, about prognosis, about timelines, her questions precise and unemotional. When the nurse explained that I was heavily sedated and not responsive, that my neurological status was uncertain, Elaine nodded as if receiving expected information. When the nurse left, their voices changed. They spoke freely, assuming my silence was permanent. Daniel asked what would happen next. Elaine answered without hesitation. She talked about insurance policies, about how long hospitals kept patients in this condition, about what decisions might need to be made if there was no improvement. She used words like options and logistics and moving forward. I lay there unable to flinch as my existence was reduced to a checklist. At one point, Daniel asked if I could hear them. Elaine dismissed the idea immediately. She said people in my condition were not aware that it was cruel to imagine otherwise, that it was better to be practical. I wanted to prove her wrong so badly it felt like my chest would split open, but my body remained still, betraying me. More visits followed. Lauren's voice entered the room one afternoon, light and careful, laced with concern that sounded rehearsed. She stood on the other side of my bed, her perfume drifting toward me, familiar and nauseating. She spoke about how sorry she was, how shocking everything had been, how she was helping Daniel manage things at work. Elaine responded warmly, praising her reliability, her support. Daniel thanked her in a way that made my stomach twist. They spoke around me, over me, as if I were a piece of furniture rather than a person. Lauren asked questions about the baby, about when she could see him. Elaine assured her that arrangements were being made. Daniel mentioned paperwork forms that needed signatures, decisions that could not wait. They talked about me as if I were already gone, as if the woman lying in the bed beneath their words had ceased to exist the moment the monitor flatlined. Each conversation carved something out of me. I learned that Daniel had been designated my medical proxy by default as my spouse, a fact Elaine wielded with quiet authority. I learned that my parents had called the hospital and been told they could not visit yet, that restrictions were in place. I learned that plans were forming quickly, efficiently, without any space for uncertainty or hope. Sometimes a nurse would notice my heart rate spike during these conversations, the monitor beeping a warning that echoed my silent terror. They adjusted medication and blamed pain or stress responses common in sedated patients. No one considered that my body was reacting because my mind was screaming. Time lost its shape in that room. Day and night blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of checks and the pattern of voices. I memorized the sound of Elaine's breathing when she stood too close to my bed, the way Daniel cleared his throat before making a decision, the soft confidence in Lauren's laugh when she felt secure. I learned things I never wanted to know. I learned how quickly compassion disappeared when convenience took its place. I learned that people could discuss ending your life while standing inches from your living body and feel justified doing so. They spoke like I was already buried, like the woman I had been was a memory to be managed rather than a life to be fought for. I remained trapped, fully aware, cataloging every word, every plan, every quiet betrayal, knowing that if I survived this, if I ever found a way back into my body, none of it would be forgotten. I learned they were replacing me, the same way I learned everything else in that room through fragments of conversations never meant for my ears. Nurses talk more than people realize, especially during long shifts, especially when they think a patient cannot hear them. It started with whispers near the foot of my bed, voices lowered, but not enough. One nurse mentioned how strange it was how fast everything was moving. Another replied that grief makes people act oddly, that some families cope by staying busy. They talked about a gathering at the Whitmore house, something they called a sympathy brunch planned only days after my collapse. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. I lay there motionless, trying to understand how there could be a brunch when I was still breathing. Later that day, I heard more details the kind people share without thinking when they believe no one important is listening. Lauren had been there, one nurse said. She had held the baby in her arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had smiled for photos, stood beside Daniel while neighbors and friends offered condolences and accepted quiet congratulations from people who did not know the full story. Someone else mentioned that Elaine seemed relieved, almost energized, directing the event with her usual precision, making sure everything looked dignified. I imagined my living room filled with soft voices and careful sympathy, imagined my place at the center of it all, replaced by someone else without hesitation. The image lodged in my chest and refused to leave. As the days passed, the picture became clearer. I heard a nurse comment on the baby's name, how Elaine had suggested a different one, something stronger, more traditional, more suitable to the family image. Another nurse wondered aloud whether it was appropriate to discuss changing a newborn's name while the mother was still alive. The question went unanswered. I learned that photos had already been taken, sent out, posted privately among friends. In those photos, Lauren stood close to Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression composed and maternal. They were building a narrative, one that did not include me. My parents tried to visit during that time. I know because I heard the aftermath. A nurse mentioned a difficult phone call, an upset man insisting he had the right to see his daughter. Another nurse explained that visitation was restricted at the request of the spouse, that only approved individuals were allowed in the ICU for now. Elaine's name came up, followed by the words, medical proxy and patient privacy. The nurse sounded uncomfortable but resigned. Protocol was protocol. I wanted to cry when I realized my parents had been turned away while strangers took my place at home. But my body gave me nothing, not a tear, not a twitch. I lay there invisible and erased while my family mourned a version of me that was not dead. The humiliation was quiet but complete. Each new detail confirmed what I had already begun to understand. They were not waiting to see if I would wake up. They were not holding space for uncertainty or hope. They were moving on with purpose, stepping neatly into a future that no longer required my presence. Daniel visited less frequently, then his appearances shorter, his tone more businesslike when he did speak. When he did come, Lauren often followed, bringing updates from work, discussing schedules, offering help that sounded increasingly permanent. Elaine approved of this arrangement, openly praising Lauren's steadiness, her ability to handle pressure. They spoke of me only in the past tense. At one point, Elaine suggested it might be better if the baby bonded with someone consistent, someone stable. Daniel agreed. I felt something inside me crack at that, a sharp break that would have been audible if my body had allowed it. Even the nurses noticed the shift. One of them, a woman with tired eyes and a kind voice, paused longer than necessary while checking my vitals. She murmured that I was doing better than expected, that recovery could be unpredictable. Elaine dismissed the comment with a tight smile, reminding her that miracles were rare and expectations needed to be realistic. The nurse did not argue, but she looked at me differently after that, as if she sensed something unresolved beneath the stillness. It did not stop what was happening. Replacement continued, methodical and efficient. Lauren began referring to the baby as if he were hers in casual conversation, using phrases like our routine and our schedule. Daniel did not correct her. Elaine encouraged it, reinforcing the illusion that this arrangement was temporary only in name. I listened as my identity was dismantled piece by piece, replaced with a more convenient version that fit their needs better. They did not mourn me. They did not wait for me. They replaced me confidently and completely certain that I would never be in a position to object. Money changes the way people speak when they think no one is listening. I learned that in the ICU, where conversations floated around my bed with a casual cruelty that felt sharper than any shouted accusation. Elaine's voice was the first to shift, becoming brisk and purposeful, the tone she used when she felt in control. She spoke about insurance as if it were a weather update, something inevitable and impersonal. She asked a nurse when claims could be initiated, what documentation would be required, how long it usually took. When the nurse explained that life insurance depended on formal outcomes and that medical decisions were still ongoing, Elaine nodded as if she had expected nothing else. Later, she brought it up again with Daniel lowering her voice, but not enough. She reminded him of the policy, the one taken out years earlier, the one she had insisted on reviewing herself. She spoke about coverage amounts, about future stability, about ensuring the baby would not lack for anything. Daniel listened closely, asking practical questions, confirming details, absorbing information like someone preparing for a transaction. They never mentioned my name in those conversations, only the situation, the timing, the implications. I was reduced to a line item, a condition that needed resolution before other plans could proceed. Paperwork became the next focus. Elaine discussed access to joint accounts, reminding Daniel that as my spouse and proxy, he had authority. She encouraged him to consolidate finances to make sure everything was in order. I heard him on the phone with a bank representative verifying balances, requesting temporary access pending documentation. He sounded calm, efficient, as if handling an everyday inconvenience rather than the financial aftermath of his wife's collapse. At one point, Lauren joined the conversation, offering to help organize documents mentioning forms she had experience with from work. Elaine praised her initiative, saying it was good to have someone detail-oriented involved. I listened as they outlined tasks, dividing responsibilities, assigning follow-ups. It was unsettling how quickly my absence created space for efficiency. The baby's paperwork came next: birth certificates, hospital records, naming forms. Elaine talked about making sure everything reflected the right image, the right future. She suggested adjustments, subtle ones, things that could be justified later if necessary. Daniel hesitated briefly, asking if changes could wait until my condition improved. Elaine dismissed the idea, saying, "Delays only caused complications, that clarity was kinder in the long run." Lauren supported her, pointing out deadlines and administrative requirements. They framed it all as responsible planning, as protection against uncertainty. I felt my heart rate climb again, the monitor responding to the surge of panic I could not express. A nurse came in, checked the numbers, adjusted medication. She mentioned stress responses were common in patients like me, then left. The conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, a different nurse lingered after finishing her checks. She asked a question that sounded harmless on the surface, something about whether all the necessary consents were on file. Elaine answered smoothly, assuring her that everything was handled, that Daniel had full authority. The nurse nodded, but her hesitation was noticeable. Later, I heard that same nurse speaking quietly with a colleague at the station, expressing discomfort about how quickly decisions were being made. She wondered aloud if ethics had been consulted yet. Her concern did not go unnoticed. Elaine filed a complaint the next day, citing unprofessional behavior and unnecessary questioning. The nurse was reassigned. The message was clear. Money and authority were smoothing every obstacle. As the days went on, I heard more about logistics than about my health. Elaine discussed legal timelines, how long hospitals typically waited before re-evaluating care plans. Daniel asked what would happen if there was no improvement, what options were available. The phrasing was careful, neutral, but the intent was unmistakable. They were preparing for an outcome that benefited them financially and socially, one that required my continued silence. Lauren suggested that too much uncertainty was unhealthy for the baby, that stability mattered more than hope. Elaine agreed, praising her practicality. They spoke about me as if I were an unfortunate delay, a variable that needed resolution before life could move forward properly. I learned then that love had very little to do with what was happening. This was about control, about money, about maintaining an image that could not accommodate ambiguity. Every document, every account, every signature they discussed was another step away from me and toward a future they were constructing without my consent. Money made them careless, but it also made them bold. They believed systems would protect them, that authority and paperwork could erase inconvenient truths. Lying there listening, I understood their motive with painful clarity. They were not acting out of grief or fear. They were acting because my absence was profitable, because my silence simplified everything they wanted. And as they counted on that silence to protect them, they never considered that I was hearing every word, storing every detail, waiting for the moment when their careful plans would unravel under the weight of the truth. The truth about the twins did not arrive with drama or celebration. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, carried in the careful voice of a doctor who had already realized how much damage silence could cause. I knew something was different the moment Dr. Alvarez entered the room. He did not speak immediately. He stood near my bed reviewing my chart, his posture rigid in a way that suggested caution rather than routine. Daniel and Elaine were there too, positioned close together, their attention fixed on him. Lauren lingered near the door, her presence already assumed, already accepted. Dr. Alvarez cleared his throat and said there was something that needed to be addressed, something that had been overlooked during the emergency. He explained that during the chaos of my hemorrhage and resuscitation, the focus had been on saving my life and delivering the baby everyone believed I was carrying. What had not been communicated clearly, what had not been fully processed in the rush of those critical minutes, was that there had been a second baby, a twin. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and fragile at the same time. He explained that the second baby had required immediate specialized care and had been transferred to the NICU where she had remained since birth. She was stable now. She was doing well. She had her own records, her own medical team, her own timeline of care. For a moment, no one spoke. I felt the shift in the room before I understood it intellectually. Daniel's breathing changed, shallow and fast. Elaine stiffened beside him, her composure cracking just enough to reveal something sharp and calculating beneath. Lauren's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Dr. Alvarez continued explaining that the hospital needed to discuss next steps naming documentation parental involvement. He asked if Daniel had been informed earlier. Daniel's response came too quickly, too defensive. He said there had been confusion that he had trusted the staff to handle medical details while he focused on immediate concerns. Dr. Alvarez nodded, but his expression suggested he was no longer satisfied with easy answers, as the implications settled in panic replaced control. Elaine was the first to speak, her voice low but urgent. 2 babies changed everything. 1 baby fit the story they had been telling. 1 baby could be managed, explained, integrated into the life they were constructing. 2 babies introduced questions they could not easily silence. Where had the second baby been? Why had no one mentioned her? Why had she been hidden away? Elaine's mind moved faster than her emotions, and I could hear the calculation forming in her words as she pulled Daniel aside, speaking just far enough from the bed to feel safe. She said they needed to think carefully, that this complicated matters, that too many details would invite scrutiny. Daniel asked what she meant, his voice unsteady. Elaine replied that they had to protect the family, protect the baby they already had in their care. Lauren joined the conversation quietly, her tone practical, her suggestions framed as concern. She said people would ask questions if 2 babies suddenly appeared, questions about timing, about decisions made during my hospitalization. She said it would look suspicious. Elaine seized on that word, suspicious, repeating it like a verdict. Then she said something that made my heart rate spike so violently the monitor protested. She suggested they keep things simple. 1 baby, 1 narrative. The other baby, she said, did not need to become a problem. Daniel protested weakly, asking what that meant, insisting that both babies were his children. Elaine corrected him without hesitation. She said 1 baby was his responsibility, the one already seen, already acknowledged. The other was a complication, a loose end that could unravel everything they had planned. She spoke about private arrangements, about discretion, about people who wanted babies and asked no questions. Lauren added that it would be kinder that growing up elsewhere might spare the child from confusion and scrutiny. They spoke in measured tones, as if discussing logistics rather than human lives. I listened in frozen horror as they debated my daughter's futures while I lay powerless between them, my body betraying nothing of the rage tearing through me. Dr. Alvarez returned, then interrupting the conversation with a question about consent forms and parental access. Elaine smiled tightly and said they would need time to discuss. He hesitated, sensing tension, sensing that something was wrong. He mentioned hospital policy, the involvement of social services in certain circumstances, the need for transparency. Elaine assured him everything was under control. As he left, I felt a surge of desperation so intense it blurred into pain. 2 babies meant 2 truths. 2 babies meant 2 records, 2 teams, 2 sets of witnesses. They could not hide both. The realization seemed to dawn on them as well, turning their confidence brittle. For the first time since I had been lying there listening, I sensed fear in their voices. They had built their plans around the assumption that my story was simple, that my absence erased complexity. The twins destroyed that assumption completely. As they left the room to regroup, to recalibrate, to decide which truths to bury and which to display, I lay there still and silent, holding on to the knowledge that the very thing they saw as a problem was the crack in their armor. Two babies meant two truths, and no matter how carefully they chose, they could not erase both. The moment my body began to return to me did not feel heroic or triumphant. It felt like pain. It started as a deep, pulsing pressure in my right hand, faint at first, almost imaginary, then persistent enough that I could not ignore it. I focused on that sensation with everything I had, pouring all my awareness into it, willing it to move. At first, nothing happened, and despair threatened to swallow me again. Then, barely perceptible, my index finger twitched. It was not graceful or dramatic. It was a small, involuntary movement, but it was real. The night nurse noticed it almost immediately. She froze, staring at my hand as if afraid to hope, then called my name softly. When I did not respond, she called for another nurse, then a doctor. They tested reflexes, repeated commands, shined lights. I could not yet see into my eyes. The room filled with cautious urgency, a different kind from the chaos of my collapse. This was quieter, charged with possibility. Over the next hour, sensation spread slowly, like circulation returning to a limb that had been asleep for too long. My fingers moved again, then my wrist. My eyelids fluttered against their own weight, heavy and resistant. Someone said my name more firmly this time, asking if I could hear them, if I could understand. I wanted to answer, but my throat burned around the tube, my mouth useless. When my eyes finally opened, the light stabbed through me, overwhelming and disorienting. Shapes swam into focus, blurred faces leaning close, eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Alvarez was there. The nurse who had lingered before stood beside him, her hand pressed to her mouth. They spoke calmly, grounding me, telling me where I was, telling me to blink if I understood. I blinked. Relief rippled through the room. They removed the tube, carefully explaining each step, asking me to breathe, to cough. My chest ached, my throat raw, but I was alive inside my body again. When I could finally speak, my voice came out hoarse and broken, barely a whisper. I did not ask about my husband. I did not ask about my mother-in-law. The first word I forced past my lips was babies, not baby. Babies. The room went still. Dr. Alvarez's expression changed instantly. Professional composure giving way to shock. He asked me how I knew. I told him the truth in fragments at first, that I had heard everything, that I had been awake and aware for days, that I knew about the twins, about the NICU, about the plans being made without me. As my voice strengthened, the fragments became sentences. The sentences became accusations. I told him about the conversations, the paperwork, the discussions about my life and my children as if I were already gone. I told him about the suggestion to erase one of my daughters to protect appearances. The nurse who had first suspected something was wrong listened with tears in her eyes. Dr. Alvarez's face grew grave. He told me to stop talking to save my strength, but he was already signaling for others. Within minutes, the room filled again, this time with people whose presence changed everything. A hospital social worker arrived, followed by a representative from the ethics committee and security. They listened carefully as Dr. Alvarez summarized what I had said, as the nurses confirmed unusual heart rate spikes during specific visits as timelines were compared. They asked me questions gently, verifying details, noting names, dates, statements. I answered as clearly as I could, driven by a cold determination that cut through the exhaustion. I asked them to call my parents. When my mother and father entered the room hours later, their faces collapsed at the sight of me awake, alive, sitting up in bed. My mother sobbed openly, clutching my hand as if afraid I would vanish again. My father stood rigid for a moment, then leaned down and kissed my forehead, his voice shaking as he told me they had been told I was gone, that there had been talk of a funeral. Rage and grief twisted together inside me, but I kept my voice steady as I told them everything. The social worker listened closely, her expression hardening with each detail. She explained that given what I had described, immediate protective steps were necessary, that the hospital would restrict access, that authorities would need to be notified. Security positioned themselves outside my door. Consent privileges were reviewed and temporarily suspended pending investigation. For the first time since I had woken inside my own body days earlier, I felt something like safety. I was not back for revenge. Not yet. I was back for my children. When I asked to see them, arrangements were made carefully. One nurse brought my first daughter to me, small and warm, her weight grounding in a way nothing else had. Later, another nurse wheeled in a bassinet from the NICU holding my second daughter, just as tiny, just as real. Seeing them together stole my breath more than any tube ever had. In that moment, exhaustion and pain receded behind a single unbreakable truth. I had survived long enough to reclaim them. Whatever came next, whatever consequences unfolded beyond that room would happen with me, conscious present, and no longer silent. They came into my room the next morning as if nothing fundamental had changed, as if the balance of power had not already shifted beneath their feet. Daniel walked in first, holding a folder tucked neatly under his arm. His expression rehearsed into something that resembled concern. Elaine followed close behind him, her posture rigid, her chin lifted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lauren trailed them, careful to stay just far enough back to appear respectful, though her eyes moved quickly assessing the room, the people the guards stationed discreetly near the door. They had papers official-looking and crisp, and Elaine announced without preamble that they were there to resolve matters that could no longer be delayed. She spoke about timelines, about medical recommendations, about decisions that needed signatures. Daniel avoided my eyes, directing his words toward the foot of the bed as if I were still incapable of responding. I sat upright, propped against pillows, my hands resting calmly on the blanket. I did not interrupt. I let them speak. The more Elaine talked, the more certain she became mistaking my silence for weakness. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for a formality to conclude. I met her gaze, then steady and unflinching. I told her she should stop. The room went quiet. Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me, and the color drained from his face. Lauren froze near the door. Elaine frowned, her composure faltering for the briefest moment before she recovered. She said I was confused, that recovery could cause disorientation, that stress made people say things they did not mean. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse or plead. I told them I had heard everything. I told them I had been awake while they discussed insurance payouts, while they reassigned my role in my own family, while they debated the fate of my daughters, as if choosing between inconvenient details. Daniel opened his mouth to deny it, but the words did not come. Elaine attempted to assert authority, reminding everyone present that Daniel was my medical proxy, that decisions had already been made. That was when the social worker stepped forward, her tone firm but controlled, explaining that proxy privileges had been suspended pending investigation. Elaine's certainty cracked visibly. Lauren shifted her weight, eyes darting toward the exit. I continued listing details they could not have known I possessed unless I had been listening. The dates of bank calls, the mention of account consolidation, the conversation about the second baby being a complication, the suggestion to keep one child and quietly remove the other. With each detail, the air in the room grew heavier. Elaine tried to interrupt, insisting that I was misinterpreting conversations, that nothing illegal had been intended. I turned my head slightly and nodded toward the nurse standing nearby, the one who had noticed my heart rate spikes, the one who had been reassigned. She met Elaine's gaze without flinching. Another nurse joined her, then Dr. Alvarez, then the hospital administrator. Evidence was laid out calmly, methodically. Documentation showed irregular requests for access. NICU records confirmed a second child whose existence had not been disclosed to all parties. Witness statements corroborated conversations overheard in hallways and rooms assumed to be private. The authority in the room shifted palpably, moving away from Elaine and Daniel and toward people trained to respond to abusive process. Security stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to make boundaries clear. Lauren whispered something to Daniel, panic edging into her voice. Elaine demanded to know what right they had to question her. The administrator responded evenly that the hospital had an obligation to protect patients and children when credible concerns arose. Daniel finally spoke, his voice thin, attempting to reframe everything as misunderstandings compounded by stress and grief. He said they had only wanted stability for the baby, for the family. I corrected him quietly. I told him he had wanted convenience. I told him stability did not require erasing a mother or hiding a child. The police arrived shortly after, two officers in plain clothes who introduced themselves respectfully and asked to speak with everyone individually. Elaine bristled, demanding a lawyer. Lauren's composure collapsed entirely, tears streaking down her face as she insisted she had only been trying to help. Daniel stared at the floor, his confidence gone, his carefully managed image unraveling. I watched it all without satisfaction or anger, only a steady resolve that surprised even me. When the officers asked me to confirm my statements, I did so, clearly recounting events in sequence, answering questions without embellishment. I did not need to exaggerate. The truth was sufficient. Elaine was informed she was being investigated for fraud and interference. Daniel was advised of his rights and escorted from the room for further questioning. Lauren was detained for statements related to conspiracy and misrepresentation. As they were led out, Elaine turned back, once her face twisted with disbelief, as if she still expected someone to intervene on her behalf. No one did. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality. The room felt lighter after that, as if a weight had been lifted from the air itself. The social worker explained the next steps: protective orders, temporary custody arrangements, legal proceedings that would follow. I listened, absorbing it all, my focus steady. They had come to pull the plug, armed with paperwork and certainty. Instead, the truth unplugged them, exposing every careful calculation they had made. I did not need to shout or threaten. I only needed to be present, alive, and willing to let the facts speak. In the silence that followed, I understood something with absolute clarity. Their power had depended entirely on my absence. The moment I returned, it vanished. Justice did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive loudly. It came in steps, measured and procedural, the way real justice usually does. In the weeks that followed, my room became a place of meetings rather than machines. Attorneys spoke carefully, social workers explained processes, and doctors focused on helping my body recover from trauma that went far beyond what appeared in my charts. The investigation moved forward quickly once it began, fueled by documentation, witness statements, and records that could not be explained away as misunderstandings. Daniel was formally charged with fraud and custodial interference, after evidence showed he had attempted to manipulate access to accounts and medical decisions while misrepresenting my condition. Elaine faced charges of forgery and conspiracy when it became clear she had pushed for altered paperwork and unauthorized decisions under the assumption that I would never regain capacity. Lauren, stripped of the protection she had relied on, was charged as an accomplice for knowingly participating in misrepresentation and attempting to position herself as a legal guardian without standing. None of it felt dramatic in the way stories often do. There were no courtroom outbursts, no sudden confessions. There were hearings, filings, quiet exchanges between lawyers, and the slow dismantling of the narrative they had built to protect themselves. Daniel lost his parental rights permanently after the court determined that his actions posed a risk to my children's safety. Elaine's social standing collapsed almost overnight, her reputation unraveling as details became public through legal channels she could no longer control. Lauren disappeared from my life entirely, her ambitions reduced to legal defense and survival. I did not follow their cases closely after that. I did not need to. My focus shifted to healing in ways that had nothing to do with punishment. I was granted full custody of my daughters with protective orders in place to ensure distance and safety. The accounts Daniel had accessed were frozen, then restructured into trusts established solely for my children, overseen independently. Insurance money that had once been discussed as an incentive was redirected by court order, stripped of its original intent, and placed where it belonged, securing my daughters' futures rather than rewarding betrayal. Recovery was not easy. There were nights when my body ached with phantom pain and days when exhaustion settled deep in my bones. Therapy became part of my routine, not just to process what had happened, but to learn how to trust my own strength again. My parents moved closer, offering support without control, presence without conditions. Slowly, life began to rebuild itself around quieter moments. The first time I walked unassisted through a park near our home, pushing a double stroller beneath trees just beginning to turn green. I felt something loosen inside me. My daughters lay bundled beside each other, their breaths soft and steady, their existence undeniable and whole. Watching them, I understood that survival was not the end of my story, only the beginning of a different one. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or justify my boundaries. The people who had tried to erase me were gone, their influence severed by truth and consequence. What remained was not vengeance but clarity. I learned that silence can be mistaken for weakness, but presence changes everything. I learned that systems can fail, but they can also be corrected when someone refuses to disappear quietly. Most of all, I learned that motherhood is not something that can be transferred or replaced at convenience. It is earned through love endurance and the refusal to give up even when the world believes you already have. They tried to erase me. Instead, they taught me how powerful survival can be. I am not defined by what was done to me in that hospital room, nor by the plans made in my absence. I am defined by what I reclaimed afterward, my voice, my children, and my life. And every morning now, when I wake to the sound of two small breaths in the next room, I know exactly where I belong, alive, present, and unafraid of the truth. If this story made you pause, take a breath, or feel that quiet pressure in your chest, stay with me for a moment longer. Stories like this are uncomfortable for a reason. They force us to look at truths we often avoid about power silence and what happens when decisions are made for someone instead of with them. This isn't just a dramatic story. It's a reminder that awareness can save lives, that understanding your rights, your voice, and your value matters long before a crisis ever happens. Education begins when we pay attention to warning signs instead of dismissing them. I want you to think honestly about what you would have done in my place. Would you have known who had authority to speak for you? Would you have protected yourself legally, emotionally, or financially? Or would you, like many people, have assumed trust was enough? Share your thoughts in the comments because conversations like these create awareness that no policy or warning label ever could. If you're watching from the US or anywhere else, drop your location below and let me know you're here. This community matters, and every comment helps amplify stories that educate as much as they engage. If this story taught you something about patient rights, family boundaries, or the danger of staying silent when something feels wrong, please hit the like button and subscribe. Supporting this channel means supporting stories that encourage critical thinking, self-protection, and accountability. These aren't just stories meant to shock you for a few minutes. They are lessons about recognizing control, questioning authority when necessary, and understanding that survival often begins with knowledge. More stories are coming, each one designed not just to entertain, but to inform, to warn, and to empower. Stay with me because the next story might teach you something that could one day protect you or someone you love.